Jon Stewart. It wasn't just Robert Redfield, the former CDC director, back in June of 2021, almost 2 years ago. Jon Stewart appearing on the Colbert Show.
There's a chance that this was created in a lab. There's an investigation.
A chance?
Well, but
oh my
if there was
God.
evidence, I'd love to hear it.
There's
I just don't know.
a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do we do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan Novel Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. The disease is the same name as the lab. That's just a little too weird, don't you think? And then they ask the scientists, they're like, how did this... So wait a minute, you work at the Wuhan Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. How did this happen? And they're like, a pangolin kissed a turtle. And you're like, no, the name of your lab. If you look at the name, let me see your business card. Show me your business card. Oh, I work at the coronavirus lab in Wuhan. Oh, because there's a coronavirus loose in Wuhan. How did that happen? Maybe a bat flew into the cloaca of a turkey and then it sneezed into my chili and now we all have coronavirus. Like, come on.
Wait a second.
What about this? Listen to this.
Wait a second.
All right.
John.
Oh my God. There's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness near Hershey, Pennsylvania. What do you think happened? Like, I don't know. Maybe a steam shovel mated with a cocoa bean. Or it's the chocolate factory. Maybe that's it.
That could be.
Yeah. Maybe Department of Energy should bring Jon Stewart in-house. We could have figured this out a couple of years ago.
It's just a moment of levity when we needed it.
For more on this and other topics, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, VP at the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation, author of Brutal War, Jungle Fighting in Papua New Guinea, 1942. Jim, were you shocked by the Wall Street Journal report on the Department of Energy's conclusion the virus originated in Wuhan?
No, when this first broke out, first of all, that was hilarious. And people say, well, it was in a lab. And I said, well, look, we pay attention to this part of China because this is a part of China where these kinds of diseases come out of. And indeed, we set up a whole World Health Organization reporting system just to deal with this kind of issue. And everything completely broke down. So, I have to admit, I was not dismissive of a natural born disease outbreak. And because it was consistent with the facts we had. Having said that, I said, look, we don't know where this comes from, but we do know. And this, to me, even if people don't want to believe this, that it was leaked from a lab, here's the one thing that is completely 1,000% factually true is there was a global pandemic because of the malfeasance of the Chinese government. They knew this disease was communicable. They let people go all over the world, particularly vacationers who went, or people came back for the holiday and then went back to Italy. They withheld critical information that we created measures just for reporting because they screwed up so bad the last time. So, and if you run the timeline, and we had a 3 or 4 month head start on dealing with this disease, it would have been much more easily to contain this thing. So, regardless of whether you believe this is true or not, China is absolutely completely at fault. I think the one thing we've learned here is really how despicable our own government was in not aggressively pursuing this, and against the wishes of the President of the United States, who at the time said, I want to know about the Chinese virus, and instead his own government was kind of...
How dare you call it the Chinese virus? Yeah, how dare you call it the Chinese virus?
Right.
But here's the thing. So the only government that is less interested in holding China accountable than China is the United States government, it seems to me, because if we announce that, yes, this is, we've concluded that this is indeed the truth, then it will require some sort of accountability mechanism, some sort of reckoning with the Chinese communists, and it doesn't seem like the Biden administration has any interest in going down that path.
Well, this is the real news story. This is the real story. As your government comes out and said the Chinese not only withheld critical information and responded, well, they may have, accidentally leaked it from the Biden and hid the fact from the world. this administration has just concluded negotiations on a global pandemic treaty, which addresses none of the faults of WHO, none of the faults of China, gives more power to the WHO, violates your civil liberties, and China had the audacity in the treaty to insist that they be treated like a developing nation, which under the treaty requires that we hand over intellectual property and all kinds of response money to developing nations. So China wants to actually be, if there's another pandemic, to be rewarded. And this treaty was negotiated with the United States at the table. Matter of fact, the United States putting these things in the treaty. So not only are they not responding to the fact that China is responsible, they're not talking about reparations or holding them accountable for anything else. They're talking about how to protect China so the next time it happens, China can't ever be held responsible again. And empowering the people who actually made the pandemic worse and linked to it. The treaty even says they get to decide what disinformation is, right? So the people that leaked the stuff and hid the truth, the people that told us things over and over that absolutely knew were not true, they're in charge of disinformation. This is unbelievable. This may be the most egregious thing this administration has ever done. It's called the zero draft treaty. And it's completely beyond the pale. And it was negotiated by your president, knowing all the things that went wrong the last 2 years.
And you mentioned that this infringement on our civil liberties. What power does it give the WHO? Are we ceding our sovereignty in terms of pandemic response to the WHO?
So one of the things, yes, and one of the things this treaty actually says is, you don't really have to treat this like a treaty. And so the U.S. government actually had them write into the treaty that you don't have to treat it like a treaty, so they can just sign it and not go to Congress and get it ratified. So they actually actively work to circumvent the U.S. Constitution.
I want to go back. Is there going to be any repercussions against China for accidentally or maybe purposefully leaking the COVID from the lab? I mean, are we going to stop funding it at the very least?
We're how many years in? And 2 full years into the Biden administration. Have they shown any? I mean, I think the drafting of this treaty is a pretty darn good sign that they have no plans about going back and being tough with China. This is actually their MO on everything. They don't want to be tough with China. They want to seem like they're tough on China because they know people want to be tough on China, so they want the street cred for that. They have absolutely no stomach to actually take on the Chinese at all. And this treaty is absolutely proof. I wrote about it on my Substack. But a lot of people, this is the thing that really want to scare the bejesus out of you. If you actually just go Google this treaty, you'll see all these articles glowingly talking about how wonderful the treaty is. Or you'll see articles saying, well, it's not tough enough. It doesn't go far enough. This is nonsense. They want to in the event of a pandemic, companies have turned over all their intellectual property to the World Health Organization. I guess this not what to do with it.
Staying on China, but folding in Russia and Ukraine, your reaction to China's proposed quote-unquote peace plan to bring the war in Ukraine to an end?
Okay, the China peace plan is a peace plan, like a Chinese menu. It's Chinese food.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Need I say more?
Yeah.
I mean, it literally is a nothing burger. And for them to actually throw this out there where they're actively considering coordinating with the Russians to provide the military support just goes to show how unbelievably feckless they are. But, I think this is behind all this China stuff. China is very adept and innovative and flexible. All this wacko stuff they're doing now, it's not for you. It's not for me. It's not even for Ukrainians or the Europeans. They perceive that what they call, quote unquote, the global South, Africa, parts of Latin America, these people aren't getting upset about China. And so they're giving them every reason to kind of like the Chinese. So people in Africa will go to South Africa, the Chinese have a peace plan, right? So it's propaganda and they go where they flow where it's easy. They're getting pushback in Europe, they're getting pushback in the United States, but less so in Latin America and Africa, where they write checks and greedy people are just happy to cash them. that's where this propaganda is really into it.
Jake from the State Department was on Meet the Press yesterday. He was asked about what victory looks like in Ukraine for the Ukrainians, and of course, where it's not up to us to define it, that's up to Zelensky to define it. And then he was pressed by that yapping little terrier Chuck Todd on that very issue. Okay, well, if it's up to Zelensky to define it, then he has defined it, and that includes taking back Crimea. So why don't we adopt the same position that Jake Sullivan has? Take a listen.
Well, President Zelensky said it. Victory is all of the territory back. Why don't we say the same thing now?
Well, we have repeatedly talked about Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in its internationally recognized borders. The question for us is, how do we put Ukraine in the best position on the battlefield so that they are ultimately in the best position at the negotiating table? And President Zelensky, as recently as this week, has said we are going to have to ultimately get to a diplomatic phase of this conflict. So from our perspective, our goal is to strengthen the hand of the Ukrainians on the battlefield so that they are in the strongest position with the most leverage when they get to the negotiating table to ultimately achieve an outcome that restores Ukraine's full sovereignty and territorial integrity.
If they want to take Crimea militarily, will the United States help Ukraine do that?
Chuck, the critical thing right now is that they need to take back the territory in the south and the east that they are currently focused on, and we need to give them the tools to be able to do that. The question of Crimea and the question of what happens down the road is something that we will come to. Where we are right now.
So why don't we just fold in with Zelensky on his stated desire to take back Crimea? That's integral to anything that resembles victory. Since we're following his lead, why not follow his lead into Crimea?
Aren't you glad that, Jake Sullivan's not your doctor?
Yes.
Doctor, am I going to live? Well,
we don't.
Here, this is the sad thing about these yahoos is they actually have an opportunity when they go before the American people to explain to the American people what we're doing and why we're doing it, and they talk like they're in a meeting over at the State Department with a bunch of other diplomats. What's in it for us? I mean, the problem with that whole conversation, it never for 1 second said, what is the American interest here we're trying to protect? Mm-hmm. How are we going to protect that? And how does it support that? I've said this many, many times. Look, we love Ukrainians. They're marvelous people. I've been to Ukraine many times. I wish them all the best in the world. We're not in Ukraine for Ukrainians. We're in Ukraine because Putin's ambitions were far greater than Ukraine, and they serve the Chinese ambitions as well. And that stopping Putin in Ukraine is the best for everybody, by the way, including for the Ukrainians. And the reality is every day Putin fights, his military gets weaker, he has less capacity to threaten other people, and we should be talking about those things, not about whether they get Crimea back or not. Which is, we always ask the questions we want to know the answers to, as opposed to the questions we can answer. There's a whole saying: the enemy gets a vote. Vladimir Putin has just as much as how this ends as the Ukrainians do. We don't know what's in his mind and when he's going to stop fighting and what that looks like. But the question is, what does victory look like for Ukraine? Quite honestly, I don't care. What I care about is what is in the best interest of the United States, and what are you, Jake Sullivan, going to do to make sure that happens? And in that whole conversation that went on and on and on, he never spent 5 seconds addressing that.
Right,
what's in it for Americans? Yeah. How are we going to protect your interests? We never heard those words.
Well, that's because they're citizens of the world in the Biden administration, of course. They transcend our corporate boundaries. Something else, though, on Ukraine. Charlie Gasparino had an interesting piece in the New York Post about the big bankers meeting with Zelensky, talking about Larry Fink at BlackRock, talking about Jamie Dimon at Morgan Stanley, with the idea of raising private funds to rebuild that country. And we're talking in the tens of billions. So Wall Street sees economic opportunity in Ukraine once the hostilities subside, potentially, and Zelensky does more to root out corruption. That's specifically Wall Street bankers saying it, according to Gasparino on the corruption piece, not House Republicans. And something else, though, that Gasparino observed sort of from the conversations with these titans of Wall Street, which is Zelensky believes that he basically has a blank check from America in perpetuity, that the money that is flowing will never stop flowing. How should we read Wall Street's interest in Ukraine and Zelensky's attitude toward this country based on what he's getting from the Biden administration?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think that's true. I met with Zelensky and many senior Ukrainian officials, and they don't think they have a blank check. They don't think they want a blank check. So that's not coming from the Ukrainian government. That's coming from our government. Our government's the idiots who are saying, well, whatever it takes, whatever we can spend, whatever. It's like America is this giant ATM where we have to do all the deposits and they get to do all the withdrawals. I will say I would much rather Ukraine be rebuilt with private sector money than with taxpayer money. Taxpayer money and development has proven incredibly ineffective and stupid. Why would the private sector do that? Well, look, Ukraine could actually be a very successful, productive country. First of all, it is the agricultural breadbasket of the entire world. It's in a great position logistically. It could integrate it with the West. It has actually a very, very good workforce. As a matter of fact, Ukrainians having to flee Ukraine has actually been a boon to the rest of Europe because it's really helped add it to their workforce. So there's no reason why private sector money couldn't rebuild Ukraine.
I agree with that.
That's what they do.
I agree with that, Jim. But you know what
China.
Yeah, but you know what the issue is. That's not the issue. The issue is Wall Street driving our policy. That becomes the issue.
Well, I don't think Wall Street should drive policy, and I think that Ukraine should be built by the private sector on commercial terms that are open and transparent and respectful of rules of the West, and not by China, and not by governments who will give a blank check. And this is the real problem. Ukraine could win the war and lose the peace. They could become an aid-dependent basket case like Afghanistan. And you know what? That country will then be weaker and more open to this. And look, I don't know what the Wall Street bankers are up to. Quite honestly, much like the Chinese and a lot of people, these people talk big and do nothing. But I do think Ukraine will be a good investment for private sector investment after the war. And I think that's the way the country should be built, and we should all want that.
Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, VP of the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Jim, thanks as always.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
This message is for anyone looking for $500,000 to $1 million or more of affordable term life insurance. Even if you have diabetes, high blood pressure, or are taking anxiety meds. Here's an example. If you're